The full release of Baldur's Gate 3 is almost upon us, and whether you're an early access veteran or entirely new to the game, we can all agree it's overwhelmingly massive, especially for beginners. So with that in mind, we've put together a few tips and tricks that you absolutely must know before you roll up your character and head out into Baldur's Gate 3 proper. Number 1 on the list won't be a surprise for anyone who's actually played Dungeons & Dragons before. Stealth is your friend, and you should be surprising your enemies as much as you can. By pressing Ctrl-C, you can get your entire party into a coordinated crouch, essentially placing all of you into stealth. If you can avoid being detected, whether by risking a dice roll or getting into position without entering enemy sightlines, you can basically stun enemies for a round, allowing you to get some huge attacks in. This makes the rogue class especially beginner friendly in combat, since you'll have a much easier job sneaking up on your opponents. And as anyone who's played D&D will tell you, rogues are a pretty great class in the game anyway, and that stayed true in Baldur's Gate 3. That said, any character, provided they're made with dexterity and stealth in mind, can be just as sneaky as any rogue, especially in the earlier levels, so just make sure you've got at least one character pumped up on dex, and take advantage of the enemy's stunned surprise as you shank them in the back. Next up, don't be afraid to let your character fail. You're going to see a lot of tips and tricks, videos and articles around that'll advise you to save often to make sure that you can stay on top of those bad dice rolls and avoid the pitfalls of a death that can add hours of wasted time onto your save. And while the logic is somewhat sound, you should be saving fairly regularly, just like you would in any absolutely massive RPG with the potential to crash on you. But don't be afraid to roll with the punches and let your failures play out. Dice rolls and failing them are a massive part of D&D and, by extension, Baldur's Gate. And while it can obviously up the difficulty, especially if you're taking on a powerful enemy in combat, what you'll actually find is that a lot of the time, the consequences of your failure are just as interesting and occasionally hilarious as your successes are, often more so. So don't rob yourself of the experience and embrace the chaos. Tip number 3, keep your party as balanced as you can, but don't make it the basis of your playthrough. There's no right or wrong way to play Baldur's Gate 3. In fact, your choices of mates to explore the massive game world with are entirely down to you, and if you want to pick your favourites and rock out with a party of melee characters or a band of spellcasters, you do you. As it seems I'm determined to do, I'll be bringing this back to a regular game of D&D, and if you've played before, you'll know most people would like to play in a party that's at least a little bit balanced. You want your tanky melee, whether it's a paladin, fighter or a barbarian, your sneaky rogue type for locks and backstabbing, spellcasters who can take pot shots from a distance, and a healer. Definitely a healer. But plenty of classes blur the lines between these party roles. A paladin can be just as comfortable using cure wounds as they can smiting a demon back to hell. And a wizard can always cast the knock spell to unlock a door if you don't have a rogue on hand to pick the lock for you. In short, the potential paths characters can walk in Baldur's Gate 3, well, they're pretty wide. So while you should always keep some semblance of party balance in mind before you head out to your next big boss fight, sometimes it's just fun to play with a party full of bards, you know? Next tip, loot everything, and if you don't need it, send it. Look, I get it, Baldur's Gate 3 can be an overwhelming place to be. There is stuff everywhere, and if you're anything like me, your eyes get drawn by every shiny thing placed in your way, so a simple fetch quest can quickly turn into a multi-hour loot sesh very easily. But embrace the loot goblin within, and loot everything. As a small housekeeping tip that'll save you hours over the course of a long save, just tap the spacebar to empty all the loot in an inventory. Life's too short to click on every individual item, and over-encumbrance is not an excuse to slow down on the theft of every object that isn't tied down. By right-clicking on any item in your inventory, you can send it to your camp for later use and free up space for even more loot, so make sure you're doing some basic inventory management as well. Final little tip on looting, for those of you who, like me, lack the basic sense of perception, if you hold down Alt when you're not in combat, it gets a lot easier to spot the items lying around. Give it a try and thank me later when your camp is full of loot. Alright, it's probably just junk, but you might need it. And finally, remember to use your companions to your advantage. Look, again, I understand, you're the main character and you want this story to be about you, but recognise that the beefy barbarian you've stuffed with high dex, strength and con, and dumped charisma with, might not be the best person to have a tough conversation with a city guard. Using your companions when their strengths outweigh your own is crucial to success in Baldur's Gate 3, and while I said in a previous tip that failure can be fun in its own way, you do want to set yourself up to succeed as much as you possibly can. So when you're doing something like initiating conversations, make sure it's your more charismatic folk, the bard or the sorcerer, for example, who step up as the primary dice roller. Otherwise, you might find yourself getting into fights a bit more often than even an angry barbarian would like. So there you go, just a few beginners tips and tricks to help you through the early days of Baldur's Gate 3. The game is absolutely massive, even in early access, and we've had a hell of a good time exploring it. But with the game soon set for its full launch, we're going to have a lot more guides and news on the way. So for all your Baldur's Gate 3 needs, make sure you stick with us here at GG Recon and check out these videos here.